Every president leaves office with at least one decision he would rather history forget. Some signed away the freedom of millions. A few blundered into wars they could never win, or trusted men who looted the government from the inside. This runs through all 45 of them in order, from the first president to the man in office now, picking the single decision that historians keep circling back to when they add up the cost. You will soon understand why a handful of these names sit heavier than the rest. George Washington. The federal government became a partner to the slave catcher in 1793, when the first president signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law. Bounty hunters could now cross state lines, grab anyone they accused of running, and strip that person of any chance to argue the case before a jury. Free black Americans disappeared to the South on nothing more than a stranger's accusation. Washington owned more than 100 enslaved people himself, and his signature handed chattel slavery its first real grip on national power. Whole families vanished into bondage because of those few pages. John Adams, fear of France did the thinking in 1798. Adams, rattled by an undeclared naval war and a hostile press, backed the Sedition Act and let federal prosecutors aim it straight at opposition editors and a sitting congressman who dared to mock him. Printers landed in jail for the crime of insulting the government. The First Amendment, barely 7 years old, took its first serious wound from the same generation that wrote it, and the backlash carried Jefferson into the presidency 2 years later. Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson gambled that the world needed American cotton and grain badly enough to obey him. His Embargo Act of 1807 sealed every American port and banned all exports, a bet that economic pain abroad would force Britain and France to respect the young country's neutrality. At home, the gamble curdled into a complete disaster, with ships rotting at the wharves, farm prices in freefall, smugglers working the Canadian border by night, and New England cursing the president who promised to protect it. He punished his own citizens harder than the empires he set out to starve. James Madison, declaring war on the British Empire in 1812, might have worked with an army and a treasury behind it. Madison commanded neither. His militia drilled badly, and his government ran on fumes, so the early campaigns fell apart almost on contact, and British troops eventually marched into the capital and put the capital and the president's house to the torch. The peace treaty 2 years later redrew nothing and restored the old borders, which turned the burned city and the gutted finances into the price of a war fought before anyone bothered to prepare for it. James Monroe. Monroe handed Andrew Jackson a narrow assignment in 1818, secure the Georgia frontier against Seminole raids. Jackson read it as a license for conquest. He stormed across the border into Spanish Florida, seized its forts, threw out the colonial governor, and hanged 2 British subjects on charges he essentially invented, and all without a word of authorization from Washington. Madrid fumed, and London bristled. Monroe's refusal to either rein his general in or spell out clear orders nearly dragged the Republic into a second war with Britain, though the same reckless campaign frightened Spain into surrendering Florida through the Adams-Onis Treaty the following year. John Quincy Adams. No president ever sabotaged himself more efficiently than John Quincy Adams. Clinging to an ideal of government floating above party, he kept hostile holdovers in their federal posts and refused on principle to reward the men who put him in office. The loyalists wandered off, his enemies, comfortable in the very jobs he declined to take from them, hollowed out his administration from within, while his agenda stalled in Congress and his re-election drifted out of reach. Honesty, in his hands, became a slow and thorough form of political suicide. Andrew Jackson. Defying a direct ruling of the Supreme Court, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830 and set about emptying the Southeast of the people who lived there. The court sided with the Cherokee. He brushed the decision aside, and federal soldiers rounded up the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole to drive them west from land their nations occupied for centuries. Thousands never finished the walk. Cold, hunger, and disease killed them along the route the Cherokee still call the Trail of Tears, while white settlers and planters carved up the emptied homelands inside a single generation. The president overrode the highest court in the country and paid nothing for it. Martin Van Buren. A banking system in free fall greeted Van Buren the moment he took office, and he answered the panic of 1837 with the very gold and silver dogma that helped trigger it. Banks collapsed by the hundreds, while he refused any federal rescue. Instead, he poured his attention into an independent treasury, a scheme to wall off government money from the wreckage as unemployment climbed and storefronts emptied across the country. One full term dissolved into depression. A presidency built on doing as little as possible accomplished exactly that. William Henry Harrison, 31 days. The whole Harrison presidency fit inside them, and the cause of his death turns out murkier than the school book version tells it. Generations blamed a marathon inaugural address, delivered hatless in cold rain, though modern physicians point instead to enteric fever bred in the filthy water piped into the White House. His real blunder ran quieter. He let a siege of office seekers grind down an aging man already breathing a contaminated Capitol's air, and his collapse pitched the country into a succession crisis nobody knew how to handle. John Tyler. Tyler reached the White House by accident and spent his term feuding with the party that delivered it to him. The Whigs elected him expecting loyalty. He repaid them by vetoing their national bank bills, the centerpiece of everything they stood for. His entire cabinet quit in protest, save one. Whig leaders then expelled him outright, leaving a president stranded without a home in either party and floating, for the first time in American history, as a target of serious impeachment talk. He governed the rest of his term essentially alone. James K. Polk. Polk wanted the Pacific Coast, and he took it. Provoking a war with Mexico in 1846, he annexed roughly a third of that country and brushed aside every warning that swallowing so much land would reopen the fight over slavery. Within weeks, the Wilmot Proviso landed in Congress like a lit match. The question of whether the new Western territories would allow slavery shattered the old Missouri Compromise and shoved the nation years closer to the Civil War that Polk swore his conquest would never cause. He won the West and lit the fuse under the Union in the same stroke. Zachary Taylor, a slaveholder demanding that California and New Mexico enter the Union free, hardly the Zachary Taylor the South expected. He pushed further still, threatening to lead the army in person against any state that breathed the word secession. Southern leaders recoiled, and the moderates he needed recoiled with them. His flat refusal to bargain froze Congress in a standoff that carried the country to the brink of disunion a full decade early, until his sudden death in the summer of 1850 cleared the path for the very compromise he kept blocking. The general would not negotiate, so the negotiating waited for his funeral. Millard Fillmore. To buy the compromise of 1850, Fillmore signed a law that conscripted ordinary citizens to catch slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act threatened Northerners with fines and jail for refusing to help capture runaways, and denied the accused any right to testify, to counsel, or to a trial, and the free states answered with fury. Crowds in Boston and Syracuse physically blocked slave catchers, while the Underground Railroad swelled and the Whig Party cracked along the seam. A measure sold as the nation's glue dissolved it further. Franklin Pierce. Tearing up a 30-year truce, Pierce drove the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress in 1854 and let settlers vote slavery up or down in territory the Missouri Compromise once closed to it. The plains caught fire. Pro-slavery and free soil gunmen torched each other's towns and traded murders in a frontier war the newspapers christened Bleeding Kansas. The Whigs dissolved in the smoke, and an openly sectional party calling itself Republican rose to take their place. Few presidents did more to render the coming war a certainty. James Buchanan. Watching the Union come apart, Buchanan decided the Constitution left his hands tied. He pronounced secession illegal and, in the same breath, declared that no federal power existed to stop it. So he stood frozen while southern states proclaimed independence and seized arsenals, mints, and forts. His earlier backing of the pro-slavery Lee-Compton Constitution already inflamed the North. 7 states broke away before he vacated the office, and Lincoln inherited a presidency confronting an armed, organized rebellion that Buchanan permitted to take shape. Doing nothing handed his successor a rebellion already in arms. Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln's worst decision, dressed up as clever ticket balancing. Hunting for a unity slate in 1864, he dropped Vice President Hannibal Hamlin and replaced him with Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee War Democrat who never hid his contempt for black Americans. The ticket won. Then an assassin's bullet at Ford's Theater installed Johnson in the White House, and Reconstruction lurched toward the defeated South almost overnight, restoring the planter class to power and stalling real civil rights for the better part of a century. One choice meant to secure an election warped the 100 years that followed it. Andrew Johnson. No one expected the accidental president to govern as the Confederacy's friend. Johnson used the power Lincoln's murder dropped in his lap to shield the men the Union defeated only months earlier, pardoning ex-Confederates by the thousand and vetoing the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He let the black codes bind freedmen back into something close to slavery. His war on Reconstruction provoked the first impeachment of a president in American history and exposed newly freed black citizens to the violence and disenfranchisement that would shape the South for generations. A single Senate vote kept him in the job. Ulysses Grant. Personally honest, Grant trusted the wrong men and let them strip the government bare, skimming millions through the whiskey ring and the credit mobilier fraud while he vouched for their character to the end. Scandal trailed both terms. The graft drained his credibility and dissolved public patience for the Southern Reconstruction he claimed to back. His party drifted toward writing off the freedmen it once swore to defend. A war hero left office as the era's byword for corruption. Rutherford B. Hayes. The most disputed election in American history ended with a bargain that doomed millions. To secure his contested win, Hayes agreed to withdraw the last federal troops from the South. The instant they marched away, Reconstruction died. Freed from any outside check, Southern governments gutted black voting rights almost immediately, opening the era of Jim Crow, mass disenfranchisement, and lynchings that stayed unpunished for nearly 100 years. Hayes traded the presidency for the freedom of an entire people, and the people never cast a vote on it. James Garfield. A pile of customs house jobs consumed Garfield's brief presidency. He sank scarce political capital into battling the stalwart faction and its boss, Senator Roscoe Conkling, over who would staff the New York Customs House. One bitter office seeker brought a revolver to settle the matter. Charles Guiteau, certain the president owed him a post, shot Garfield in a Washington depot, and the slow infection in the wound killed him that September. His murder finally shamed Congress into the civil service reform he never lived to sign. Chester A. Arthur. Arthur vetoed the cruelest version of the bill and then signed one barely gentler. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 slammed the door on an entire nationality of laborers. The first time federal law barred a people by race, and mobs across the West read it as open permission. Anti-Chinese riots tore through frontier towns, relations with Beijing curdled, and the statute laid a blueprint for bigotry that bent American immigration policy for the next 60 years. A self-styled reformer wrote racial exclusion into the law. Grover Cleveland. Cleveland met the panic of 1893 with a rigidity that broke his party and his presidency together. He defended the gold standard to the bitter end, forced repeal of the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, and ordered federal troops to crush the Pullman strike at bayonet point. As the Depression bit deeper, farmers and workers deserted the Democrats in droves, and the party split between Cleveland's gold men and the silver insurgents who would seize it in 1896. Labor never forgave the bayonets. His rigidity gift wrapped an entire generation of national power for the Republicans. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison. Sign a tariff that gouges your own voters, and they will remember in November. Harrison learned it the hard way with the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which drove import duties toward 50%, the the steepest peacetime rates the country ever saw. Prices on everyday goods spiked within months. Working families paid more for tin plates, blankets, and clothing, and the resentment detonated in a Republican rout at that autumn's midterm elections. 2 years later, the same tariff swept Harrison himself out of the White House. William McKinley. Empire or independence, McKinley chose empire and dragged the country into a war it never needed. After beating Spain, he annexed the Philippines rather than let the islands rule themselves, and Filipino fighters who expected liberation turned their rifles on a fresh occupier. The killing dragged on for years. American troops herded civilians into camps, torched villages, and shot insurgents and bystanders alike in a counterinsurgency that mocked everything the Republic claimed to believe. A nation founded in revolt against empire became one itself. Theodore Roosevelt. Leaning on the biased reports of a hostile Texas town, Roosevelt discharged 167 black soldiers without honor and without a single hearing in one sweeping order. Locals pinned a Brownsville shooting on the men of the black garrison. Not one of them faced a trial. The president punished soldiers who served the country faithfully and betrayed the African American voters who stood by him, leaving a stain that no amount of trust-busting ever scrubbed away. The Army cleared their names 6 decades later, long after most of them died. William Howard Taft. Taft ran on cutting tariffs and then signed one that kept them sky high, gutting his credibility with the reformers who trusted him. The Payne-Aldrich tariff of 1909 came out of a backroom deal with conservative Republicans, protecting exactly the rates progressives demanded he slash. They felt knifed. The rupture he opened drove Theodore Roosevelt back into the ring in 1912 on a third-party ticket, splitting the Republican vote down the middle and handing the White House to Woodrow Wilson. One tariff quarrel cost the party the presidency. Woodrow Wilson. Convinced of his own righteousness, Wilson refused the Senate, a single concession on the League of Nations, and ordered his loyalists to reject any treaty short of his original design. The Senate killed it outright. The country he meant to steer into a new world order stayed out of the very league he built, draining its authority before it drew a first breath, and leaving the post-war settlement without the one power that might have steadied it. His critics judged the segregation he imposed on the federal workforce no more kindly. Stubbornness lost him the peace he spent the war chasing. Warren Harding. Harding handed cabinet seats to his poker buddies and stood back while they robbed the public. His circle, the so-called Ohio Gang, ran their departments as personal cash machines, and none worked it harder than Interior Secretary Albert Fall. Fall secretly leased the Navy's Teapot Dome oil reserves to private drillers in return for cash, bonds, and a herd of cattle. The bribery sent the first sitting cabinet officer in history to a prison cell and welded Harding's name to corruption, even though he died before the full rot surfaced. His friends destroyed him from inside his own administration. Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge slashed taxes on the wealthy and told Washington to keep its hands off the market. When the Federal Reserve eyed the wild stock speculation swelling through the decade, he waved it off, trusting prosperity to discipline itself. The bubble grew and grew. His hands-off gospel left the whole financial system brittle and overstretched, so that when the crash struck months after he left office, the damage ran far deeper than it ever needed to. A policy of doing nothing, it turned out, carried a body count. Herbert Hoover. Hoover meant to protect American farmers and instead strangled global trade. Signing the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, he raised import duties to record highs at the precise moment the world economy started caving in. Other nations retaliated within months. Foreign governments piled tariffs onto American goods. Exports collapsed. Farm income cratered, and a national slump congealed into a worldwide catastrophe that erased years of possible recovery. The remedy threw gasoline on the fire. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Executive Order 9066 carried Franklin Roosevelt's signature, and it locked up more than 120,000 people for the accident of their ancestry. Wartime panic and old racism, not a shred of real evidence, drove the order that swept Japanese Americans off the West Coast and into guarded camps in the desert. Most of them held citizenship. Families surrendered homes, farms, and businesses they would never see again, spent years behind barbed wire, and carried the trauma down through their children long after the shooting stopped. The Supreme Court blessed it then and managed an apology only decades afterward. Harry S. Truman. Truman let MacArthur chase a beaten enemy north across the 38th parallel and watched a contained war metastasize. Driving toward the Chinese border to unify Korea by force, the general triggered the exact intervention his own commanders warned him about. 100,000 Chinese troops and more poured across the line. The Americans buckled into one of the longest retreats in their military history. The front eventually froze near where it started, and tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians died to fix a boundary that barely moved. That boundary still cuts Korea in two. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower turned the CIA loose on two elected governments and bought the country decades of blowback. Chasing Cold War advantage and the interests of American corporations, he greenlit coups that toppled Iran's Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 and Guatemala's Jacobo Arbenz a year later, planting strongmen in their seats. Both nations bled for it. Authoritarian rule and savage repression followed in each, and in Iran, the bitterness the coup planted finally erupted in the 1979 revolution that gave the United States a permanent enemy. Covert operations purchased the loudest consequences. John F. Kennedy. Kennedy inherited a CY, a scheme to overthrow Fidel Castro, and signed off on it against his better instincts. He put roughly 1,400 armed exiles ashore at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, then pulled the American air cover the plan depended on and watched the operation bleed out on the sand in 3 days. The humiliation welded Havana to Moscow and rolled straight into the missile crisis that carried the planet to the brink of nuclear war. Cuba chose the Soviets, and Kennedy handed them the reason. Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson engineered a domestic revolution and then sank it in the mud of Southeast Asia. Citing a Gulf of Tonkin clash that intelligence later admitted never fully occurred, he funneled hundreds of thousands of combat troops into Vietnam, chasing a victory that backed away from him every time he reached for it. More than 58,000 Americans came home in coffins. Millions of Vietnamese died. The war ripped the country into hostile camps, and the fury it loosed at home devoured the consensus behind his great society and finally chased him out of the 1968 race. The man who delivered civil rights ended his presidency hostage to a war he could not win. Richard Nixon could have survived the break-in. The cover-up is what finished him. Rather than cut the burglars loose, he turned the FBI, the CIA, and the IRS into instruments to bury the investigation, never guessing his own secret tape recorders preserved every order he gave. Staring down certain impeachment, he became the only president ever to resign the office in August 1974. He left behind a public that would never again grant Washington the benefit of the doubt. Watergate taught a generation to expect the worst. Gerald Ford. 1 month into the job, Ford pardoned Richard Nixon and torched his own presidency to do it. He called the full, unconditional pardon a way to bind up the nation's wounds, but voters smelled a deal cut between the new president and the disgraced old one. His poll numbers cratered overnight. Suspicion of a corrupt bargain bled away the goodwill he started with, crippled his footing in Congress, and helped sink his 1976 race against an obscure Georgia governor named Jimmy Carter. Mercy for one man cost Ford the trust of millions. Jimmy Carter. 52 Americans sat captive in Tehran, and Carter could not bring them home. For 444 days, the hostages stayed behind embassy walls, while he hunted for a way to free them, until a desert rescue called Operation Eagle Claw ended with collided aircraft and dead servicemen far short of the city. The whole country watched its power look helpless on the evening news. Piled on top of double-digit inflation and gas lines back home, his failure to break the standoff branded him weak and paved Ronald Reagan's road to a landslide. Tehran freed the hostages, the very hour Carter handed over the office. Ronald Reagan. To free a handful of American hostages, Reagan's people sold missiles to Iran, a nation under embargo and openly hostile, then funneled the proceeds to Nicaraguan rebels that Congress explicitly forbade them to fund. The law simply did not register with them. Weapons flowed east to Tehran, and cash flowed south to the Contras, in flat defiance of the Boland Amendment. Public exposure detonated a constitutional crisis, indicted a row of senior officials, and shadowed Reagan's second term with proof of how far his White House would reach around the Congress it answered to. He insisted, again and again, that he could not recall approving any of it. George H.W. Bush. 6 words won Bush the presidency, and the same 6 words cost him a second term. He swore at the 1988 convention, "Read my lips, no new taxes," then put his name to a 1990 budget deal that raised them after all. His base treated it as apostasy. Conservatives revolted. A primary challenger bloodied him through the 1992 season, and the crack he opened in his own coalition let Bill Clinton stroll straight through it that November. A broken promise outweighed a won war in the voters' memory. Bill Clinton. While 800,000 people died over 100 days in Rwanda, Clinton looked away on purpose. As Hutu militias hacked their Tutsi neighbors apart, his administration ducked the word genocide deliberately, knowing the label would trigger a legal duty to step in. Silence proved the gentler half of it. American diplomats actively lobbied the United Nations to pull its peacekeepers back just as the slaughter peaked, stranding the handful of troops on the ground who could watch the massacre unfold but do nothing to halt it. Clinton later called that inaction the single worst regret of his presidency. George W. Bush. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003 over weapons of mass destruction that simply did not exist. Pulling soldiers and analysts off the hunt in Afghanistan, he toppled Saddam Hussein in a preemptive strike, built on intelligence that buckled the moment anyone tested it. The stockpiles never turned up. A years-long insurgency erupted. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and thousands of Americans died, and the shattered Iraqi state opened the ground that ISIS would later claim as its own. Historians filed the decision among the costliest foreign policy blunders the country ever committed. Barack Obama. Obama helped topple Libya's dictator and left a vacuum where a state used to stand, joining a 2011 air campaign that ended Muammar Gaddafi's 4 decades in power. He committed force to the regime's destruction without a workable plan for whatever came next. Chaos rushed into the empty space. Rival militias tore Libya into a failed state. Jihadist groups hacked out safe havens in the rubble, and a wave of refugees surged north across the Mediterranean from a country that no longer functioned. Obama himself later named the missing aftermath plan the worst mistake of his presidency. Donald Trump. Trump refused to concede the 2020 election and pushed the country toward the first violent rupture in its transfer of power. For weeks, he pressed the claim of a stolen vote through the courts, state officials, and rally after rally, until a crowd he called to Washington stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Lawmakers scrambled for the exits. The mob breached the seat of Congress in the middle of counting the electoral votes, stopped the certification cold for hours, and rattled a confidence in American institutions that held firm from the founding onward. Historians now rank that campaign as the gravest act of his record. Joe Biden. Biden ended the longest war in American history and fumbled the exit so badly it overshadowed everything else. He ordered the 2021 pullout from Afghanistan, a move plenty of Americans backed, yet the execution dissolved into chaos as the Afghan army and government folded in days rather than the predicted months. Kabul fell almost between one news cycle and the next. A suicide bomber at the airport gate killed 13 American service members during the frantic airlift. The Taliban swept back into the power they had lost 2 decades earlier, and a humanitarian disaster spread across the country they reclaimed. The way it ended buried the case for ending it. 45 presidencies, 45 decisions. Their defenders are still arguing about. Rank them in whatever order you like. Knowing the ranking will reveal as much about your politics as about theirs. The thread running under all of them holds steady across the centuries. Power used carelessly leaves a longer shadow than power left sitting idle, and the country usually ends up paying for both. Tell me whose mistake belongs at the very top and lay out why.